All right, well, today we're going to be doing a little bit, it's not so much me preaching as it is me talking about really doing a seminar. But, well, it's me, and I love the Bible, so we're going to start in the Bible anyway. And we're going to really give you a little bit of a background on what an idol is, and talk a little bit about false beliefs. And then we're going to get into Buddhism, and then we're going to examine what Buddhists believe. Which is incredibly confusing and contradictory depending on the Buddhist. So we'll get into that a little bit later. And then tomorrow, when we have, of course, many more people here, we'll actually do another little brief recap of Buddhism. So we'll go back over some of this again. Not a lot, but just a little bit. And then we're going to get into how to engage Buddhists in conversation. And the kind of questions we need to be asking them about their beliefs in order to hopefully create an opportunity to share the gospel with them. Buddhists do get saved. They do come to know Christ. When I was on the Israel trip, Pastor Peter and I baptized 2 Buddhists. So they came to know the Lord. They're on the trip. So like I said, salvation's a miracle. And God can save anybody. Ultimately, it comes down to whether, that person is willing to respond to His work in their heart. And I don't think we should ever write anybody off. In fact, if I look back over, 25 years of being a missionary and 30 years of pretty much sharing the gospel, I would say that the people that have gotten saved were normally the ones I didn't think would. And many of the people I thought would be easy targets are still not saved today. And it says in the Bible that, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, that there's not many noble, there's not many wise, there's not many of the intelligentsia in the world, so to speak, that will come to know Him. But God chose to put His affection upon the basically just the average people of the world, the poor people of the world, the humble people of the world. And as a result of that, many of the Christians down through the ages have been poor people involved in false religions. That God has chosen to make an example out of and saved. And really it's quite amazing, when you're involved in church work, even with D groups, when you're trying to build your own discipleship group, oftentimes the people you think that are going to just take off and be amazing, they're nowhere in a couple of years' time. And the people that you thought were an absolute lost cause, so often come around and end up being the strongest people you have. And at CCF over the years, we've seen a lot of bright sparks come and go. And then we've seen a lot of people who are slow starters actually become really strong believers and really effective disciplers. So don't always judge, as we say, a book by its cover. And remember that the work that we do is a supernatural work. We're trusting God to truly work in their hearts. So let's pray, and then we'll get started. Father, we just commit this time into your hands. We ask you to glorify yourself in all that is said and done. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, engaging worldviews. The first thing I want you to realize is that mankind is religious to the core. We are totally, incurably religious as a race, as human beings. The history of mankind shows us over and over again just how religious mankind is. Now this is the 3 categories that normally happen. Either man will bow before the one true God, or he invents one of his own, or he worships himself. But either way, everybody worships something. And of course we live in an age where really because of the result of the age of enlightenment, rationalism, man has fallen in love with his own mind. And many men worship themselves today. But a large percentage of people on planet Earth actually do believe in some kind of higher power and do worship. When you think that there's 1.3 billion Roman Catholics on planet Earth, there are like 1 billion Hindus, there's supposed to be over 500 million Buddhists, but some say the number is as high as 1.6 billion since China made itself officially a Buddhist nation. So they reckon that many more come, but that's very hard to prove. But then when you think of true Christianity, numbers in probably the hundreds of millions. So when you talk about all these different, and that's not even including the cults or the other world religions. So even if you just take the top few world religions, Islam, over 1 billion people, 1.3 billion, you're talking about there's only 7 billion people in the human race. Or 7, I forget what it is now, it's 7 something. So ultimately, with 1 billion Hindus, 1 billion Roman Catholics, 1 billion Muslims, you know, 1 billion, like you said, say Buddhists and other categories as well, that's already over half the human race, and that's not including individual belief systems. That's not including cults, which there are many. Probably, well, I've lost count. I mean, literally, I had a book which was kind of trying to keep track, but if you were going to do that, you'd need to republish every year, because you cannot keep track of the number of cults that are starting up these days. So, we find that even though atheists are very loud, and want you to think that they are the majority, actually, you can tell the students at university that you're studying with, they are a minuscule minority on planet Earth. Minuscule, absolutely minuscule. Barely worth counting in the scheme of things. But they're very loud, aren't they? And they're responsible for our education. So, as a result of that, they get a lot of media, they get a lot of news time. But the average person on planet Earth believes in a God of one form or another. That's just the simple truth. Man is very, very religious. It says in Romans 1:25, "For they," that is mankind, "exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen." What's the Apostle Paul saying? He's saying that when given a choice, man decided he didn't want to worship the one true God. Man decided rather he would worship what God had created. Whether it be something that man actually made himself, whether it be man himself, or whether it be a false religion based upon a man, ultimately, pretty much all false beliefs come because man wants to worship something. But he doesn't want to worship on God's terms. And as Jesus said, man loves darkness more than he loves light. So what does man do? Man hides in the darkness so that his deeds are not exposed as the evil that they are. And that's why people bury themselves into these false religions. They don't really want to face up to the fact that God calls the shots. God will ultimately judge them for their sin. So, most people in the world today can't deal with what the Bible teaches about God. They just can't deal with that. We live in an environment, our education system programs us a certain way, and when you get out of school and you enter the real world, people just can't deal with this idea of a biblical God. He's too narrow-minded. He's too strict. You know, he wants to impose unfair rules upon their lives. And as a result of that, they don't want to really submit to what he teaches. So, what do? They either reinvent him, they either worship him or they reinvent him to accommodate their sinful desires. And you're going to find something very funny about gods as you study the gods that different people believe in. The gods always reflect the sinful desires of the people that worship them. And they, in turn, continue to live according to the sinfulness of the God that they worship. Have you ever watched, I'm sure you watch movies, you're mostly Filipinos here. Filipinos love TV, they love movies. I'm sure you watch these like Clash of the Titans and things like that. Isn't it interesting how the gods are like men? Not just in the way they look, but in the way they act. They're fickle, right? One minute they're really happy to bless man, the next minute they turn around in vengeance and wipe out an entire civilization. I mean, these are fickle gods. There's no continuity to the way they act. They act like men. And they behave like men. I mean, what does Zeus go down? Zeus goes in and takes a disguise and sneaks into the bedroom of some beautiful young princess and basically has sex with her. You know, that's what a man would do, right? That's not what God would do, but that's what a man would do. And you see these gods, they are really made up by men, and they reflect the sinful desires of the men who invent them. Or they invent a completely new God that thinks like they do and will approve of their sinful lifestyle. So ultimately they either worship God, or they reinvent him, or they make up a new God. But they will worship something. Pretty much everybody does. And the Bible calls these false gods idols. That's Ganesh there from the Hindu religion that you can see, this weird looking elephant. I don't know why anyone would want to worship that. If I was going to worship a false god, it would look a lot better than that, but I don't know. I mean, they worship this Ganesh god. And you have to recognize that God takes idolatry really, really seriously. All the way throughout the Bible, we find over and over again, God actually coming in like a ton of bricks, we say in English, and really laying out swift and monumental justice upon these nations. And a lot of times that's what, if I do Q&A, that's a question that comes up. How can I reconcile Jesus with the God of the Old Testament? Well, the answer is, that was Jesus. See, Christians are so blind sometimes to the Bible, they don't realize that no one has ever seen the Father. So the God who is acting in the Old Testament is Jesus. That's Him, Yahweh. Okay? Think of Yahweh as God's last name. That's a good way of thinking about it. So you have Father Yahweh, Jesus Yahweh, and Holy Spirit Yahweh. And they're all Yahweh. That Yahweh is a personal name for God. So in the Old Testament, when Yahweh acts, Jesus is acting. And the Father may pronounce a judgment, but Jesus is in 100% agreement with it. There's no division between them. They are completely unified in what they do. So when God said, go in and wipe out the Canaanites, that was Jesus saying, go out and wipe out the Canaanites. And a lot of Christians have a hard time with that, because they have actually built up this Jesus in their mind, but actually He's not the Jesus of the Bible. And one of the things that I like to do in Manila, when I talk about Jesus and the subject of Jesus, is sort of like try and get a feeling in people for what Jesus they worship. Because a lot of times I think with Filipinos, and it's not just Filipinos, in England as well, people are worshipping a Jesus that doesn't exist. And that then throws into question their salvation, doesn't it? You have to ask yourself, if you're worshipping a Jesus that doesn't exist, then, you know, are you saved? Are you really trusting in the God of the Bible? Because Jesus is absolutely against idolatry, and He is totally in favor of judging those that participate in it. And if you don't believe that, then you don't know Jesus. Jesus is really, really, I mean, like I said yesterday when we were talking, He is very harsh sometimes when He deals with the religious leaders, right? Because why? Why is He so harsh with the religious leaders? Because they're leading people astray. People look to them. Now, it's different when you're talking to an average, confused person. Jesus was very gentle. He was very accommodating. He was very gracious with them. You know, you can see Him coming up. He goes to dinner with Zacchaeus. You know, he says to Matthew, you know, come and follow me. We're having dinner at your house tonight. And he goes in there and he hangs out with them and he has a meal. And he gently instructs them. But when it came to the religious leaders, it was totally different. When it came to the religious leaders, it was a major confrontation. And time again, He shut them down. It got to a point in John chapter 7, when it says in John 7, the religious leaders were silent. Why were they silent? Because every time they opened their mouth, He shut them down so hard, they were tired of getting wasted in front of their people. So they stopped saying anything. And the crowd began to say, oh, are our leaders approving of Him now? They're not even talking. They're not saying anything. That's because when they opened their mouth, He really gave them an incredibly hard time. So we have to understand God hates idols. Jesus hates idols. The Holy Spirit hates idols. And yet man loves his idols. So this is something we have to address. It says in Psalm 115, not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory. In other words, we're not the ones that need to be glorified. We're just sinful human beings. But you, O Lord, you need to be glorified. Because of your loving kindness, because of your truth. We saw that the other night when those of us who were at the God and Suffering seminar, how God has demonstrated His love for us. He deserves to be worshipped because of the love that He has demonstrated. Why should the nations say, where now is their God? But our God is in the heavens and He does whatever He pleases. Boy, human beings do not like that. Because we're filled with pride. And we want to think that we somehow have a say in things. To believe in a God who does whatever He pleases, whenever He pleases. That's hard for human beings to grasp. Especially if they're not Christians and they're coming from a different religion where they think they have a part to play. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of man's hands. They have mouths, but they cannot speak. They have eyes, but they cannot see. They have ears, but they cannot hear. They have noses, but they cannot smell. They have hands, but they cannot feel. They have feet, but they cannot walk. They cannot make a sound with their throat. It's amazing how the Bible goes over the same thing over and over again, isn't it? It's almost as if the writer is grabbing you by the lapels and shaking you and saying, don't you get it? Are you really that dim that you will sit there and worship a God made of silver or wood or stone when you could worship the God of the heavens? Are you really that far from the truth? And ultimately, this is what the psalmist is saying here. Those who make them, and this is very interesting, will become what? Like them. Everyone who trusts in them. Ultimately, you become what you worship. If you worship money, you become what? A materialist. Right? Suddenly, materialism is the most important thing in your life. If you worship power, you probably become a politician. I mean, bottom line is, whatever you worship will have a profound impact on your life. So according to God, people invent false gods according to their own sinful desires, and then they become just like them. The gods at the bottom here, these are Canaanite fertility gods. Alright? These false gods and belief systems that have sprung up around them reflect the sinfulness of the people that invent them. A good example of this is the Canaanite god Baal. One of the reasons God commanded the people of Israel to wipe out the tribes in Canaan was their worship of this god. Now, one of the biggest accusations against God when you do Q&A with certainly atheists and people who don't believe in God is, how on earth could a good God commit genocide? That's one of the biggest questions you get. And it's actually incredibly easy to answer. Because they deserved it. I mean, it's that simple. They deserved it. Now, I have to be careful how I say this. I cannot repeat back to you what I have read about the Canaanites. It is so filthy, it is so vile, that you feel like your mind has been dirtied just reading it. Now, if you're really that interested, you can look it up online and read it for yourself. But I assure you, you won't be edified by doing it. The Canaanites were one of the most vile people ever to walk the face of the earth. They were horrible. This is one of their temples. I believe, I'm not sure, but I believe that one of these arches was actually transported to New York, to the square in New York, and put up as an exhibit a few years back. And there was a great deal of sort of in the news about it because Christians were outraged. Because that's where they used to sacrifice babies. At the arch. Horrible. The Canaanites believed that Baal was the god responsible for sexual power. Sexual acts and perversions, and believe me, if you think society is perverse today, you haven't even begun to understand perverse. What went on back then compared to what went on today, my goodness me. Here, at least, the society draws the line on homosexuality. There, they didn't have any lines. It went into the animal kingdom and it went with children. Okay? It was awful. Horrible. There was no restrictions to the sexual perversions that they committed. Temples were erected and occupied by prostitutes. They called the prostitutes priestesses because that sounds a lot better, right? And they were considered to be holy women. Because when you had sex with them, you were united in sexual passion with Baal himself. And this belief actually continued on even until the time of Jesus. When Paul was going and preaching to the pagans in Thessalonica and Ephesus and places like that, they still believed this. There were temple prostitutes in every single city. And you would go to the temple and you would literally, you'd probably pay them. I'm pretty sure you paid them. They were prostitutes, so I doubt you got it for free. So you would pay them money and you would go in and you would literally have sex. And they would have big orgies where everyone just has group sex. And that's considered worship to God. You would have thought that would catch on pretty fast today, wouldn't you? The way society is going, I'm amazed we're not there. We're not there yet. But I think we will be there. I think the way things are going, don't you think we're heading in that direction? Things get worse every year. You might say, well, what did they do then with all the unwanted children? There's no contraception in those days. It's one thing to be a prostitute when you have contraception in the morning after pill. It's another thing to be a prostitute when there's no way to deal with it. Well, they had a way of dealing with it. the unwanted children were sacrificed to Baal in fertility ceremonies. They would take the newborn child while it was still alive, and they would burn it alive. Now that's pretty awful, isn't it? And I'm sure you're not edified by hearing that. But you need to understand why God wiped them out. God was not going to let it continue. He wasn't. So God sent the Israelites in, and he said to them, wipe them out. Every single one of them. I want them gone. Now some people would say, well, what about the children that were killed? Isn't that really unfair? Well, let me give you two scenarios here. One, they're allowed to grow up and become like their parents. In which case, when they get to hell, which is where they're going to suffer a far greater punishment. Or, God takes them when they're young, and their punishment is not as severe as the punishment of those who committed these acts. I don't know if you realize this, but not all sins are equal. I know people say they are on Facebook, but it's not true. Okay? Don't believe what you read on Facebook. Never believe what you read on Facebook. Always examine to see if what you read on Facebook is true. All sins are not equal. Every sin has the same result, the same punishment. That's death. Okay? But the severity of the punishment depends on the sin. That's why Jesus said to Capernaum, "O Capernaum, if the people of Sodom and Gomorrah had seen the miracles that you've seen, they would have repented." And Jesus said to Capernaum, your fate, your judgment will be worse than theirs. There are levels of severity of punishment. Yes, all sin will send you to hell, but there are harder parts of hell than others. And there are some places in hell that will be a lot better, you'll be a lot better off being in than others. And a lot of Christians forget that when they share this with people. So you need to understand, sometimes when God prematurely takes a life, he's actually doing that person a favor. Because they're not going to believe, they're not going to go to heaven, they're definitely going to go to hell already. God knows that whether that's true or not, right? So ultimately, if they're allowed to continue to sin until they're 90, what will their fate be? Versus God allowing them to be taken when they're young. So I know in modern day society, it's hard for people to take. But remember, God doesn't think about things in terms of our limited 70 years. God is concerned with what? Eternity. God is concerned where they're going to spend the rest of eternity. So he sent the Israelites in, and he said to them, wipe them out. Wipe them all out. Every single one of them. I don't want any of them left to continue this form of worship. But you know what? They didn't do it. They didn't obey. And they made alliances with some of these people. And they intermarried with some of these people. And as a result, it became Israel's downfall. Because of that, the kingdom ended up being split under Solomon. And as a result of that, by the time of the exile, do you know what the Israelites were doing? If you read Ezekiel and Jeremiah, they were actually offering their babies in worship to Baal. Now, if they had obeyed God and wiped that out, then it would have never happened. But because they didn't obey, and they weren't strict enough, and they allowed some of these people to continue, their descendants eventually led the Israelites astray. And of course, that was Solomon's problem, wasn't it? 700 wives and 300 concubines. That's 1,000 women. Most of them, if not all of them, came from other peoples, other races. Because those races wanted to be on his good side. He had the most powerful army in the world. So they would send their most beautiful daughters, their most gorgeous princesses, they would send so that he could marry them. That didn't mean he slept with them all. I don't know. I mean, who knows what the guy was like. But ultimately, he was intimate with many of them. And what happened? They led him to worship their gods. And that was his downfall. So I don't want to extend this. I don't want to spend too much time on this. But I want you to understand how severely God sees this. Especially the practices that go along with it. Now here's what you got to get. The ultimate rebellion is that God created man in his own image, and now man invents gods in his image, having rejected God. That's the ultimate rebellion. It says in Romans 1:21, for even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks. Isn't that interesting that God would say that? God could say a lot of things. There's a lot of things he could point out. Do you know what he points out? How unthankful man is. It's interesting, isn't it? That thankfulness would be the thing that God would put his finger on. But they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. In other words, man didn't stop at making man a god. Man also made creatures gods as well. Therefore God gave them over in the lusts of their heart to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions for their women, exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. In other words, lesbianism. The women became inflamed with passion for women instead of men, just like today. And in the same way also, men abandon the natural function of women, which is to mate with them and have children, and burned in their desire towards one another, men with men, committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty for their error. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents. That's a long list, isn't it? Without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. And although they know the ordinance of God, even though the world knows that God doesn't agree with all of this, and those that practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but they also give hearty approval to those who practice them. So man gets so bad that it's not just him committing the acts, he's actually approving of people who do. What do we learn from this? We learn that they rejected the true Creator, their hearts became darkened, they began to worship creation and creatures instead. God gives them over, allowing them to do as they please, so God says, fine, if that's your choice, live with it. A sexual revolution begins, then a homosexual one led by the women. Just like today. Just like today. It's the feminist movement that's pushing the homosexual agenda. God gives them over to a depraved mind. Man continues to increase in sin, and at the same time is approving of all who join him in his depravity. Turn on CNN. That's America today. Right? That is America. That's where it's at. That is England. That's where we're at. This is where Western society is now. We have been handed over by God, and our leaders have depraved minds, and they can no longer see the truth. And that's why you'll sit there racking your brain. How can they say that? How can they believe that? How can they allow that? Simple. God has given them over to a depraved mind. They cannot see straight any longer. That's what happens when you begin to worship the created instead of the Creator. Exodus 20 says, you shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above or on the earth beneath it or in the water under the earth. So bottom line is, don't make anything at all, any image whatsoever that you plan to, what? Worship or venerate. It doesn't mean your child can't have a play farm with a plastic cow, okay? That's not what it means. It means that you don't worship the cow. That's what it means. Like the Hindus do. They pretty much consider the cow to be a very divine object. That's why when you go to McDonald's in India, I think it's the Maharaja burger, right? It's not the Big Mac. Because they don't serve beef anywhere in India. It's considered an offense. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Now look at this. Visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. That's pretty strong, isn't it? God says, it's not just going to affect you, it's going to affect your kids. And it does. But showing loving kindness to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commands. This is how God views false religions. Idols are not just images. An idol is anything you place before God. So let's bring it a little closer to home. I'm sure most of you don't bow down before a little wooden figure in your apartment. I hope not anyway, although I know it does happen in the Philippines still. But let's hope none of you are involved in that. But let's bring it closer to home. What are the popular idols today? Possessions. Possessions. Plenty, greed, always wanting more. People, your partner in life, your children. Oh boy, I see this all the time in CCF. Because we emphasize the family very strongly, there are many people at CCF who have literally made their children like a little idol in their life. Now, they don't bow down before him and worship him, but they certainly put their child before God. And that's the problem, isn't it? Yes, we love our children. We want to raise them to be godly young people. But if you put them before God in your life, you're going to start seeing repercussions of that in their lives and in yours. Even friendships, some people will put before God. How many times have we heard or seen or maybe even know people personally who have put a relationship with a boyfriend or a girlfriend before their relationship with God, knowing that God doesn't approve? Happens all the time in Manila. Oh, it's amazing. You'll laugh. I do Q&A all the time. And the girls come to me all the time with questions. Loads and loads of questions. We sit till late into the night, don't we, darling, and answering questions, and they're just asking me question after question after question. And then suddenly I notice, so-and-so's not around. Haven't seen her for a while. She's normally got questions, but I haven't seen her. And then I start asking around, and I find out she now has a non-Christian boyfriend. And of course, I'm the last person she wants to talk to and ask about that. So she's actually asking other people whether it's okay, but she doesn't come and ask me if it's okay because she knows the answer already. You see, that's when you put people before God. Pride, your reputation. When your reputation is more important than God. Pleasure, when entertainment, food, drinks, and feelings are more important than God. Like when you make a commitment to ministry. It's very important. You know what we find oftentimes these days with the younger generation in particular? So I'm speaking to the younger ones now, although you guys seem pretty committed. We've seen you around a lot. But oftentimes in Eastwood, say, where I work, I mean, we've got some really, really good young people there. But some of them, if they have an option between turning up and doing ministry, or somebody invites them to a party, the party will get priority, right? Because actually, they love pleasure more. And this generation, some of you older ones may be able to give me an amen for this, but this generation isn't so good at keeping their word, are they? Not like generations gone by. Generations gone by, people would give their word. It was their bond. It meant something to them. But nowadays, with the younger generation coming through, they change all the time. They make a commitment, but they don't keep it. Well, not all are like that, but there are many. Why? Because they're a pleasure-driven society. And if they can get more pleasure by dumping this and going to that, that's what they'll do. So that, again, is an idol. Projects, hobbies, clubs, fraternities, gym. All these things that we're involved in life. Even ministry projects can become more important than God. And you pretty soon find that out when you see the heart attitude. When you see people become very territorial about their ministry. We're not very territorial at CCF. Peter has tried to make a culture where we're not territorial. Now, it doesn't always work because the human heart is deceitful and wicked. But as far as we're concerned, I mean, people leave my D12 and go to other D12s all the time. And other people leave their D12s and come to mine. You know, their life changes, right? Things happen. And sometimes, because of the circumstances of life, especially when a young man, his eye catches a beautiful young girl in another area. Next thing I know, I haven't seen him for a while. So I start texting him, hey, where are you, Marty? Turns out he's actually over in CCF Makati every Sunday because he likes Bianca. And again, now you had to talk to him and say, Marty, you know, I don't mind. I have no problem whatsoever if you want to join Pastor Albert's D12 and pursue his daughter, Bianca. And he did, and he married her just the other week. I don't mind, no problem. But tell me, be honest about it. You know, let me know. We're not territorial. We're not going to fight about it. Do I miss Marty? Sure I do. We're going to have dinner when we go back and catch up. But at the end of the day, I want what's best for Marty. But sometimes people get really nasty, you know, because they're territorial in ministry, because people are stealing people from their group or from something else. We're not like, we try not to be like that. Why? Because then you've lost sight of the God of the ministry. And you've forgotten who's running things. So it's important. Prominence, fame, power, all these things are idols today. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. It says in 1 Corinthians 10, this is an important verse. I just wanted to do this before we go to Buddhism. What do I mean then, Paul says, that a thing sacrificed to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? And what Paul's argument basically is it's just a hunk of rock, folks. It's just a piece of wood. It doesn't have any power in it. None. I often see people handling antiques in a really funny way, as if it has some kind of power. I mean, if you don't want to burn it, give it to me, I'll burn it. I have no problem burning it. It has no power in and of itself. The only power that it has is the power that you allow the spiritual realm to have over you. But the idol is just a hunk of rock. It was really funny when I first taught on this at CCF. Gosh, it was the first time we ever did GLC, right, darling, in St. Francis. I had 800 students in basic doctrine, 400 plus on Wednesday night, and another 400 on Saturday morning. We were doing it twice a week back then. That's a lot. That's a big class, right? And I remember telling people, you know, that really Satan was a defeated foe, and that Jesus is, you know, omnipotent, and Satan only has delegated power. And I spoke a little bit about idolatry, and anyway, I spoke quite at length about it because I knew it was a problem in people's lives. And it was very interesting because next day, three boxes? 3 massive boxes were delivered to the office. And the pastors came looking for me. And I was like, what do you want? And they were like, did you order these boxes of idols? And I'm like, no, what are you talking about? This dear old lady, she wanted her house free from idols. And all the books on occult and witchcraft which she had had in her house for years. And she boxed it all up into 3 large boxes and she sent it to me. And basically for destruction, because she was still too scared to do it herself. So we just sent it all to the incinerator and had it all burned up. You know, it's just a hunk of wood. But what's behind it is far more sinister. Paul says, no, but I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to become sharers in demons. Friends, the Buddhists, when they venerate Buddha, as some do, they are worshipping demons. When the Hindus worship their gods, they are worshipping demons. When the Greeks worship Aphrodite or Apollo or Zeus, they worshipped demons. Because the demons are the ones who invented the deities. They impersonate them. That's why in Revelation it says of one of the churches that you live where Satan's throne is. Why? One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. I think I mentioned it the other night. I can't remember. But the throne of Zeus is there. And Zeus is the king of the gods. And who are the gods? The gods are demons impersonating deities. And the king of all of them is Satan. Friends, you need to understand, when people worship false beliefs, they are actually worshipping demons. And the demons love it. That's why they spend all their time setting up false religions and cults. As many as they possibly can. As long as it's not the truth, Satan doesn't care. They can be competing, they can be contradictory, they can hate each other's guts. They can be like, you know, fanatical Muslims and go all over the world chopping people's heads off. Satan loves it. Just please, as far as he's concerned, don't believe in the Bible and don't worship the one true God. That's what Satan wants. And God hates idolatry. Why? Because they're really worshiping demons. That's why. So, with that in mind, let's look at Buddhism. And like I said, we're going to kind of do an introduction to it tonight, and tomorrow we'll get down to a bit more of the nitty-gritty of how to talk to them about different issues. But let's talk about Buddhism. Buddhism is the fourth largest religious belief system on the planet. Around about 500 million, they say, but I have read estimates of 1.6 billion. It really is very wide-ranging. I don't think anybody really knows how many there are. But conservative estimates would say, as of 2010, I believe, at least 500 million. That's a lot. It's interesting to notice that in Buddhism, they rarely agree with each other on pretty much anything. I mean, they all have completely different take on what they're doing. There are many paths within Buddhism, but there are some main ones that we'll look at a little bit later on. And depending on what school you're involved in will depend on what you believe. It's an Eastern religion, but it's been growing in popularity in the West as well, mainly because of Hollywood, I think, and Hollywood's promotion of it through different movies, but mostly due to the clever way they market themselves. They've really taken hold of the deficiencies in Western culture and what people are struggling with, things like stress. So naturally, yoga is a very popular thing, right? Now, Christians don't really understand the danger of these things, and I often get that in Q&A, is yoga okay? The answer, as far as I'm concerned, is no, it's not okay. Because initially what you're actually doing is you are opening yourself up to the spirit realm. That's the idea, through meditation. So then the response that comes back to me, normally by the girls, because they're the ones who do it in the gym, they'll normally say to me, yeah, but I'm praying. I'm praying to God. And I said, well, yeah, that's okay for you, but what kind of a testimony is that for the other people around you who aren't? And I really believe, I mean, ultimately it's one of those areas where you have to make your own decision with your own conscience before God. But ultimately, I believe, having come out of the martial arts myself, which is similar in many ways in its spiritual beliefs, that there's a lot of demonic activity in yoga and in the martial arts. And I personally recommend that people get out of it as fast as they can. A lot of people don't like hearing that. A lot of young guys like the martial arts. They like the martial arts movies. They like to see Bruce Lee, you know, knocking off 20 people in one go. And I mean, they enjoy that. And I can understand that, you know, it's kind of funny. But at the end of the day, there's a spiritual dimension to it that many people don't understand. I literally watched a guy put his pinky through a sheet of corrugated iron. That's physically not possible. Science tells us that. It just can't happen. So when you begin doing things like that, you're bordering into demonic realm. And you're talking about demonic power. And when you hand your control of yourself over to other forces, that's also demonic. And you have to be very careful. So, if people do approach you on that, I would be very cautious about saying, yes, it's okay. Because I've seen a lot of people destroy themselves by getting involved in this. On the other hand, I've seen people do it just as a sport and suffer no ill effects whatsoever. So like I said, it's not a thus saith the Lord issue. You do have to exercise wisdom. But my recommendation when it comes to sin and when it comes to danger, stay as far away from it as possible. That's always the best answer, the best course. But you can see how much it's influenced the West. You'd be hard-pressed to go to a gym anywhere in the UK or the US that doesn't have a yoga class. That's how far it's spread. They've made themselves relevant, and they've addressed cultural needs, and that's something Christians have often failed to do. You know, as Christians, we need to be relevant in our message. We need to be relevant too. It doesn't mean we change the gospel. The gospel remains the same no matter what. But we need to be relevant in the way that we engage people, so that what we're sharing with them has real world connotations. It's not just pie in the sky, as we say. It's important to realize that Buddhism grew out from under the discontentment and despair that the Indian people felt under Hinduism. A lot of people don't realize this. Buddhism is a violent reaction to Hinduism. When the Aryans from Europe went down into the, I think they call it the Indus Valley in India, and they began to colonize there, they conquered the Indian people pretty quickly, and they began to rule over them. And as a result of that, they developed what's known as a caste system. And they have different levels within this caste system, often based on the color of your skin, believe it or not. It's kind of the roots of racism in many ways. And they established a caste system whereby they became fabulously wealthy, and everybody under them became fabulously poor. And as a result, Indian life was hard. The caste system led to mass poverty, an endless cycle of suffering and death through reincarnation, because that's what they believed in. And this led to hopelessness and despair. You see, poverty does terrible things to people, doesn't it? It forces you to do things that you might not normally do. And as a result of that, they keep increasing their karmic debt. Their karma keeps getting, stronger and stronger and stronger. And in order to pay off their karma, you cannot pay it off in one lifetime under this religion. So in order to pay off their debt system for the things that they have done, they have to continue to go through life again. And depending on how they live their first life will depend on what their second one will be. And you keep going through this karma system, life after life after life. The basic way the West looks at it is, if you were really good in this life, then next life you might come back as a millionaire with a Ferrari or something like that. Whereas if you live this life really badly, you might come back as a banana slug or an epis or something like that. I mean, that's kind of how the West thinks about it. But it's a lot more complicated than that. You see, even the good things you do, they create karma. So it's not just the bad. So the idea in Buddhism, that really the Buddha came up with, we'll look at this a little bit more later, was to not incur any karma at all. None. Whether good or bad. And remember, they don't think about good and bad the same way we do. They don't think of things like sin. That it's not a moral judgment. It's an impersonal thing. So they didn't want to incur good karma or bad karma because everything has to be balanced out in order to break the cycle. So if you go through life as a do-gooder and you're always doing good to other people, you're still incurring this massive karma which has to be worked out in another life. And you continue to go ahead and go ahead and go ahead. And to be honest with you, in the early forms of Buddhism, as we'll see in a minute, there was just no way to escape the cycle. It was hopeless. And to the Buddhist and to the Hindu, life is suffering. That's how they see it. And the reason they want to escape it and to break the cycle of reincarnation is because the suffering will only stop when the cycle is broken. So this is a problem, isn't it? If you believe in a religion like this, there's one thing you do not have. You do not have hope. You do not have assurance of anything. You could have 1,000,000 lives ahead of you of nothing but suffering under this system, and you don't know. To the poverty-stricken masses, being born was sorrow. Because life was so hard. Filipinos know a little bit about that. A lot of Filipinos experience the hardships of poverty. Just being born into a family in some places in the Philippines means that life is hard, hurts. Age is sorrow. The older you go, the harder it gets, right? Have you ever read Solomon on growing old? It's really interesting. If you haven't, you should read it. It's kind of funny. He talks about, he uses terminology from the creation, like trees and animals and things like that, to talk about how your eyesight is going and your arms lose their strength and bits of your body start falling off. It's really quite funny. But that's the reality of age, isn't it? The older we grow, the harder it gets. Not only that, but sickness is sorrow. And of course, if you're in a poverty-stricken environment, there was a lot of sickness. Death is sorrow. Death is hard. Death is suffering. And of course, then you start the whole system off again, and you go through it again. Clinging to earthly things, they said, is sorrow. It all brings sorrow. This view formed the backbone of Buddha's teaching. The hardship of the lives of the average people in India. So, let me tell you a little bit about this then. Buddhism and Hinduism share beliefs. Not all of them, just some of them. The ones they share, number one is karma. That's the first one. Now karma, contrary to what most people think, is a cause and effect system. When you perform an action, whether it be your conduct, whether it be your speech, or whether it be your thought, you incur karma. So you can see why the monks are always sat there trying to clear their mind of everything so they're not thinking about anything. Why? Because they don't want to incur the good karma or the bad karma. They want to maintain absolute neutrality with the karma so that there's nothing to balance out. And hopefully they will achieve enlightenment and they will escape the system of reincarnation. That's the idea. Then, of course, there's the belief in Maya. Maya is the illusionary physical and mental reality in which our consciousness has become entangled. So they see it all as an illusion. The real you, your consciousness, needs to escape this illusionary life, get away from this, and join with what they call the world soul, or the great spirit, or the divine presence, or however they might think of it. They don't think of it as God, by the way. The Buddhist has no concept of a personal God, not like we do. They don't think of it as a personal divine being. They think of it more as you're joining yourself with the great consciousness in the world. And the third belief is samsara. And samsara is reincarnation. So those are the three major beliefs that Buddhism kept when they broke away from Hinduism. Now, it was into this caste system that the founder of Buddhism was born. Now, of course, we know him as Buddha, but his real name was Siddhartha Gautama. That was his real name. And the stories say he was born the son of a minor king or Raja in Nepal sometime between 490 and 410 BC. Now, you have to remember with a lot of these stories, there's a great deal of debate. Okay? Because nothing was actually written down until hundreds of years after Buddha died. So it was all carried on by oral tradition. And many of the schools of Buddhism don't even agree. So the people will argue, but I think it's generally agreed that he was born around that time. Now some people would immediately raise an objection and say, well, hang on a second, that's before Jesus was born. Does their religion predate ours? The answer is no. Our religion begins where? In the Garden of Eden with the creation of mankind, okay? The first promise of Jesus was Genesis 3:15, where God said that one day a deliverer will come. And that was reinforced in pretty much every single story following. Cain and Abel with the sacrifice. Abel offered the sacrifice that represented who Christ would be. He shed blood. And blood is always required as remission for sin, it says in Hebrews. And then they get into Abraham. God promised Abraham, one day a descendant of yours will come and he will be what? A blessing to all the families of the earth. And so on and so forth. All the way through up to the Passover, when God instituted the sacrifice of a lamb for the nation of Israel. It's all Jesus, 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 Jesus throughout the entire Old Testament. So don't be deceived by people who say Buddha came first, therefore we need to believe that the Buddha is a better person to listen to. The Buddha and Jesus had nothing in common, as we'll see a little bit later on. But that will surprise a lot of Buddhists, by the way, if you want a talking point. Ask them if they see any similarities between Buddha and Jesus, because they do. The Buddhists think that they're very similar and that their teachings are very similar. But as I'll show you tomorrow, that's not really the case. His parents were rich. They lived in a very wealthy palace as far as the stories go. And he lived a sheltered life to the point that he actually didn't leave the house until 29. They kept him within the walls of the palace until he was almost 30 years old, which is not unusual back in those days. 30 was considered to be the time when you became a man, when you actually came to full maturity. Henson's a man, is he? Almost. So, I don't know if you've ever studied Jesus as a prophet, priest, and king. Prophets took up their office at 30, normally. The kings were anointed and actually came to power normally at 30. Not always, but that was the main mark. And the priests couldn't serve in the temple until they were 30. So 30 was the age. And how old was Jesus when he began his ministry as prophet, priest, and king? He was 30. So in Israeli society, that was something. There was something special about being 30. So my dad always used to say to me growing up, "You're not a man till you're 30." So anyway, they were very rich, and they protected him, and he led a very sheltered life. At age 29, he left the palace for the first time and encountered 4 sights that his privileged life did not prepare him for. After that, everything changed in his life. Now again, these are stories. They may or may not be true. But they were certainly the stories that people have told ever since he was around. The first sight he saw was an old man. Now some people, some versions say, because remember, the Buddhists have many different kinds of scriptures, and unlike our Bible, they all contradict each other, okay? So it depends on what school you belong to as to which scripture you're going to follow. But there's 2 accounts, mainly 2 accounts. One account is all these things happened to the same person, and he saw these things happening to the same person in different points of time. The other story is it all happened on one trip out of the palace, and he saw these things happen to 4 different people. So it's difficult to know. Again, it's just guesswork, really. There's another account that said his father was so powerful and rich that he used to actually make sure that when his son actually left the palace at 29, that everything that was negative had been removed from his path. So that as he traveled through the town to the park where he was trying to go, he would no bad sight would come across his eyes. That was another version of the story. I find that a bit hard to believe, but that's what they say. The second sight was of a sick man. The third sight was of a corpse. Okay, so you've got a little bit of a progression going on here. First of all, the guy's old, then he gets sick, and then he dies. So it is possible it was the same man, and this happened over a period of time. And then, having seen this horrible sight, which he, of course he had never seen before, he saw a monk. And the monk was so peaceful. He was there contemplating his belly button, and he felt, I don't know what he was contemplating, but that's what they say. A spider's web, or a ripple in a pond, or something like that, as they show in the movies. And he was there contemplating these things, and he was absolutely at peace. And it left a massive impact on his life. He said, that's what I want. He was obviously very disturbed by the things he had seen, and as a result of that, he longed for that peace and tranquility. So, as the story goes, upon seeing the peaceful existence of the ascetic monk, he decided to become one himself. He left the life of privilege, he abandoned his wife and his newborn son, and he pursued enlightenment. 7 years. Apparently, he was very good at suppressing his own desires. Some people are. I mean, there are people, even in the world today, who just sit in a cave and just contemplate and meditate all day long. That's all they do. Their disciples bring them, a bowl of rice and some food. But it's not a very nice existence, but they do that because they believe it'll earn them enlightenment. And he was very skilled at meditation. And as the story goes, after 7 years, it all came down to one night. He ate one final bowl of rice. That was it. Then he sat down under a fig tree, or what they call a Bodhi tree, and he determined in his heart that he would meditate until either he died or he achieved enlightenment. And again, he got it very quickly, considering people go their whole lives and don't get it. And actually, no one's ever really gotten it. But apparently, he got it in one night. He faced the temptations that night, and he faced his inner demons, as they say. And he meditated the night away, and at the end of that night, he had achieved enlightenment. Now, I don't believe that for 1 second, but that's what they teach. After enduring a long night of temptation, he claimed he had finally arrived. His followers called him the Buddha, which means the enlightened one. And he began to teach other monks, and he had 5 of them, became his first disciples. And from then on, it spread to a religion of millions around the world today. It was in India, mostly in the early days, and eventually, of course, it spread to China, it spread to Japan, it spread to other places as well. Okay, so he believed that enlightenment was to be found in the middle way. And the middle way forms a bulk of their belief system, okay? He didn't believe in indulgence, and he didn't believe in austerity. He didn't believe in extremes. He believed that, you should just walk the middle path between both. Now, obviously, he'd experienced both. He had lived a life of indulgence, and he had lived a life of deprivation. And his conclusion was, neither of those is helpful, but it's best to walk the middle path. He began to teach 4 noble truths. The first, to live is to suffer. Now, I think most of us would probably agree with that. I mean, life does have its challenges, doesn't it? And it's certainly not all easy. Now, for those of us who love the Lord, we look at these challenges in a different way to how other people look at them. But to an average person living on planet Earth, I'm sure they would view life as difficult. Not easy, it's a challenge. Especially if you're poverty-stricken and you have to fight for everything you have. You see the people in Manila living in the shanty towns down around the cities. I mean, they literally have to fight for their meal that day. They have to fight to find a place to sleep after the government bulldozes it and they don't have anywhere to live. I mean, they have to fight just to maybe scrape a few coins together to get one of their kids into school so that there's a chance that they might get a job and earn a little bit of money, and everything they do is a battle. And remember, the whole of society was like that back then. It wasn't like today where people do live in incredible really privilege in the West in many ways. But back then, it was only the intelligentsia, it was only the Aryans, it was only the upper class who lived with that kind of wealth, and they were few. So life was suffering. Suffering is caused by desire or attachment. Okay? So one can eliminate suffering by eliminating all attachments. And this belief system teaches the idea is you want to get rid of anything that you're attached to. Sounds like Star Trek and the Vulcans. I don't know if you've ever seen the Vulcans on Star Trek, but that's kind of what they do. Their goal is to eliminate emotion. And they do that by eliminating attachments and passions and things like that. And ultimately, this is a similar kind of belief. And this is achieved by following the Noble Eightfold Path. So the question is, what's the Eightfold Path? Well, the Eightfold Path is having a right view, and your view is determined by the 4 Noble Truths. The right intention, that's to renounce sensual pleasure, malice, or doing harm to other people. Speech, causing no harm through your speech. Action, love, joy, and no immorality. He actually was quite strongly against immorality, but that would change later on in Buddhism. The livelihood, he believed you had to be a monk. And early Buddhism used to teach that. There was enlightenment and nirvana only for the monks. But that would change later on as well. See, even in Buddhism they had relativism. People didn't like the fact that only the monks got enlightenment. So they had a little bit of a revolution. Effort, morality, meditation, and wisdom. Mindfulness, remain alert regarding sensations and ideas. Don't allow anything to slip past. Concentration meant you needed to live a life of focus. So these guys were very disciplined. They were very, very serious about what they were doing, very seriously minded. They were men of great focus and resolve. And in many ways, you admire their ability to keep themselves under control. But at the end of the day, when it's all done in the name of a false religion, it was all for nothing. And that's really the sad thing. I'm impressed sometimes by the way that other religious people, the level of their commitment and the level of their focus and their willing, considering they don't have the Holy Spirit helping them. I mean, it's kind of impressive how willing they are to make the sacrifices that they do. When you think that sometimes we as Christians who have the truth are often quite lazy regarding those things. I guess, like they said, familiarity breeds contempt, and you tend to sit back on your laurels sometimes instead of recognizing it. The sacred writings of Buddhism are called the Tripitaka, or the Pali Canon is the Western term for it. The Mahayana Sutras, which is a massive collection of writings. And then there's the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is designed to guide your consciousness through the afterlife, okay? I don't really know what use it's going to be to you once you're dead. But, the bottom line is I guess you read it in advance. But I'm wondering who wrote it, because the Buddha never came back from the dead. And neither is anybody else except Jesus. So the only person ever to come back from the dead, as far as we know, and tell us what happens after is Jesus. And one of the great ways to engage Buddhists is on this issue. The Buddha never talked about nirvana. He never answered questions regarding it. He didn't talk about creation or anything like that. He had no answers for that. But we worship someone who came back from the dead. Buddha never claimed to be God, and Buddha never claimed to be the way. He just claimed to know the way. Now, whereas our God is very much different to him. The Pali Canon, which means the word of Buddha, contains a mixture of Buddha's teaching and that of his pupils, but once again, it was written down a long time after he died. And considering there is no God aiding the process, as in our case with the Bible, we have an all-knowing God who sovereignly kept his hand on the Word and through the power of the Holy Spirit revealed the Scriptures. But they don't believe in a personal God. They don't believe in a divine being who can do that. Therefore, how on earth they all remembered and knew what to write down, nobody really knows. And that's why it's all so contradictory. Nobody really knows what he said. In Buddhism, they have the three jewels. That's the Buddha, he's the first jewel. He's the enlightened one. Then they have the Dharma, which is the teachings of Buddha. And then they have the Sangha, which is the monks that practice the Dharma. So you'll sometimes see reference to the three jewels and the three baskets. The three baskets is the Tripitaka, and that's the Vinayapitaka, which is the rules and the guidelines for monastic life. So if you want to become a monk, this is what you need to know. This is the discipline. And it's so detailed, it even takes you down to how to make your robe. Okay, so it goes from morality and how you should act and behave, down to the way that you need to conduct yourself, down to how you dress yourself. Then you have the Sutta Pitaka, and that has to do with the sermons, discourse, and teaching within Buddhism. And then you have something I really have no idea how to pronounce. Teaching on the mind, the matter, and time, and that's really the philosophy of Buddhism. So these are the three baskets that they talk about. Now, in regard to this is not exhaustive, okay? There are many, many other Buddhist scriptures that we could talk about. And when you meet individual Buddhists, it would be good to establish what are they actually reading, so that you can then look it up online and see what it means and what they're actually saying. As I said, this is a religion that is highly contradictory. And actually, that you can have two Buddhists in a room, and they might not agree on anything, except Buddha himself. That might be the only thing that they would come to an agreement on. Do Buddhists believe in God? It's a good question, isn't it? The answer is, they have many deities, and they have many exalted beings, but they don't believe in God. Isn't that interesting? So you will find that they will even have little idols, depending on what sect of Buddhism they're from. I'll speak about that in a minute. So they might even have idols in their house, but not believe in God. Others believe that Buddha became a god. But Buddha never claimed that, and many other Buddhists would say no, he didn't. So even within Buddhism, they can't agree on who Buddha is, whether he was God or not. Some believe that he became like a god, and others say no, he was just enlightened. Some Buddhists are pantheistic in their view. Others are theistic and do believe in like a one consciousness kind of thing. Others would be considered atheistic. And I think here in Hong Kong, that would probably be the greater group. I think you'll probably meet more people. They basically blend their Buddhism with Confucianism, and they blend it with Taoism. And as a result of that, they begin to view the world slightly differently. And they don't necessarily believe in a God at all. So again, what do you have to do when you're witnessing an evangelism? You have to talk to them. You have to ask them, why don't you tell me what you believe? And that's a great way to get people talking. When you're not preaching at them, but you're listening to what they believe, people are normally happy to talk to you. And especially if you know them. So you're going to have to start by doing a little bit of investigation and find out what kind of Buddhists are they. Are they even a Buddhist at all? Are they, a syncretism of all sorts of different ideas? Classical Buddhism doesn't really talk about an absolute being like God at all. In fact, it's considered atheistic. All right? The difficulty with Buddhism is its diversity. Even if you studied it, you'd only know the path you studied. It can be divided very loosely into two main paths, which they call vehicles. All right, and then the second path has actually been subdivided over time into a major path itself, but really it comes out of the second one. The first is Theravada, or the small vehicle. And this is the monastic one. This is the original kind of Buddhism, which really is tied much more closely to what Buddha was himself, an ascetic monk. Ultimate enlightenment and nirvana, of course, because they're monks, is reserved for the monks. Okay? But the other one, the Mahayana, or the large vehicle, those guys are a lot more enlightened and a lot more relativistic. They believe that enlightenment and nirvana is extended to everybody else as well. So even within Buddhism, you've got a major disagreement between those who are most serious about their faith and those who are more nominal about their faith, about who actually gets saved. I don't think so. There's no, like I said, there's no personal God. So they don't think in terms of a person like we do. And then later a third path was introduced called Vajrayana, and that is surprisingly the smallest of the paths, yet probably the most well known, because that's the one the Dalai Lama belongs to in Tibet. All right? He practices this path. So that's interesting, isn't it? And this path has to do more with what we call Tantra. And Tantra is when they embrace a lot of the magical and mythical beliefs that some of the more way out Hindu sects used to believe in. So they have charms and they have mantras and things like that. And you were asking me yesterday, Vaughn, about beads. That's where the beads come in. Because they would use the beads to count the number of times they said the mantra, or the number of times they breathed, or the number of times they spoke Buddha's name. And it was basically a counting device, the beads that you see them with. And in addition to that, this path was very different from the others. The Theravada, or the Mahayana, is more about the traditional meditation and following the path to enlightenment. Whereas the Vajrayana was very, very different. They were involved in a lot of motion. They would move a lot. They had sacred movements that they performed. I guess it's probably, I haven't really studied Tai Chi, but I would think based on this that Tai Chi probably comes out of that, or at least has a base in it, you know? Because ultimately this is like holy movements, you know, things that they consider. And surprisingly enough, they had very active sex lives, okay? There was a lot of sexual activity in Vajrayana. They considered that part of their, you know, path to enlightenment. So that was very useful, you know. Basically, you've got one side of Buddhism saying, no attachments, you know. You need to detach yourself totally from all of this. And you've got the other side saying, come on, let's have a sexual party under the direction of the gurus. So there's a lot of weirdness going on in Tibet, I'm telling you. And it would be very interesting, I think, to take a visit to Tibet. Not to watch the orgies or anything, but to see the, you know, to see how this is carried out, because it's so contradictory to the rest of Buddhism. So then there's Tendai, like I said, Vajrayana, Nichiren, Singom, Pure Land, Zen, Ryobu, and others. There are so many different paths within Buddhism. You can literally make up pretty much any path you like, and you'll probably get a following. So, but it's not much different in Christianity, is it? There's pretty much every aberration under the sun that you could possibly think of out there when it comes to Christian doctrine too. So it's no different for us. It's important to realize Buddha never claimed to be a god. Never. And he never claimed to be divine. And he never claimed to be the way. Not like Jesus did. As far as he was concerned, he simply showed people the pathway to enlightenment. That was as far as he was willing to take it. But of course, his followers took it a lot further than that. It was his followers that elevated him to the status of a god, and even then, many Buddhists still don't believe that he was a god. John 10 says, I and the Father are one. Jesus most certainly claimed to be God. It then goes on to say, the Jews picked up stones again to stone him. Jesus answered them, I showed you many good works from the Father, many miracles. For which of them are you going to stone me? They answered him, for a good work we do not stone you, but for blasphemy. And because you, being a man, make yourself out to be God. Jesus claimed to be God all the time. Every time he said, I am, he was telling them he was God. I am the way. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. He told them he was God all the time. But they didn't believe him. Jesus said, I am the way. Buddha says, I just showed the way. Now, just a small example of something you could talk to a Buddhist about and say, what do you think the similarities are between Jesus and Buddha? Do Buddhists believe in sin? Well, the answer is no. They don't see sin the way we do. It falls into the category of ignorance. So people are not sinners, they're ignorant. That's the way people see it. I would love to ask a Buddhist that after somebody broke into his house and murdered his wife. You know, is the guy just ignorant? How do you see it? Because it's a good question, isn't it? People will have a certain view until it hits them personally. And then they might have a very different view. Because to the Buddhist, there's no retribution. There's no vengeance. The Buddhist isn't allowed to do harm. So as far as he's concerned, this is just an ignorant man that needs instruction. But if somebody came along and killed his child, would he really believe that? I doubt it. Certainly in modern society, I think you'd be jumping up and down to have this guy arrested, prosecuted, put to death, gas chamber, a lethal injection. I mean, it's your child. You're going to be absolutely beside yourself. And when you see people at their worst in a moment of tragedy, you then find out what they really believe. That's why with Job is a great example of indestructible saving faith. Because as far as the Bible is concerned, if your faith is genuine, it won't fail. Even though you may struggle, and you may hurt, and you may have a really difficult time getting through it, you won't walk away from Jesus. But unbelievers will. And it's very interesting for the Buddhists. He has this hypothetical sort of like belief that there's no sin. That things are not right or wrong. People are just ignorant. But when it really hits that close to home, does he still think that way? That's not a bad question to ask them, is it? To the Buddhist, error is not a moral issue at all, since it is ultimately an impersonal mistake. The wicked man is simply an ignorant man. He does not need punishment. He doesn't need condemnation. He just needs instruction. But the West is becoming a lot like that now. Have you noticed that? We don't put people to death anymore, not like we used to. Even though God, it says in Romans 13 and 14, has given the governments of the world the right to bear the sword, which means take a life. Capital punishment is legal as far as God is concerned. I hope you realize that. A lot of Christians in Q&A will ask that. Is capital punishment okay? The answer is yes. Why is capital punishment okay? Because God has given the governments of the world the authority to take a life in order to keep the peace. Now, it doesn't mean they always do it as they're meant to. It doesn't mean there isn't abuse of that system. But ultimately, that's God's department, not ours. So all these Christians picketing government offices and saying capital punishment needs to be done away with are wrong. God does say it's okay. Just read Romans 13 and 14 if you don't believe me. God says obey the law. Because if you don't obey the law, you deserve what you get. Wow. A lot of Christians need to read that, right? A lot of them today involved in social revolutions, trying to overthrow things, and the Bible actually takes a completely different view. So, punishment, condemnation, in the Buddhist mind, unnecessary. He needs to be educated. Crazy, isn't it? But that's what they believe. Then there is the karma. Karma is important. Buddhists do not believe in sin the way Christians do. They believe in karma. Now this is a Sanskrit term which literally means action or doing. In Buddhism, karma refers to action driven by intention which leads to future consequences. Now remember, they don't see things as necessarily sinful. So you can have things that have a negative impact and a positive impact. They would see that. It's not a moral law. It's a system of cause and effect. It's not making a judgment on you about whether your actions are right or wrong. Now isn't that interesting? Because in Western society now, we're very influenced by this, aren't we? Nobody is willing to call people out and say, that's wrong. They just say that, well, to me, you know, I can't go along with that. I don't like that. It's pretty much only Christians out there these days, and people of a very conservative political bent, that are actually out there saying, that is wrong and it needs to stop. Other people are saying, well, truth is relative. There's no such thing as absolute truth. And in the Buddhist system, that's exactly true. So it's not a moral law. It's a system of cause and effect. It makes no judgments about right and wrong. It simply points out that actions have consequences. Some of those consequences are desirable and good. Others are undesirable and bad. But in karma, you don't want either. Because you want to get out of the system. Try and break the cycle. For the serious Buddhist, the goal is not to work for good karma, but to accumulate no karma at all. None. Karma keeps you bound to the cycle of life and death and rebirth. And since life is suffering, the idea is to free yourself entirely from the system. Wow, sounds horrible, doesn't it? I mean, to spend your entire life contemplating nothing, to not do good in case you incur karma, and to not do evil or bad or negative things so that you don't incur karma, but to just try and live a life of neutrality. That's why monks separate themselves from the world. They don't have to interact with anyone but themselves. They eat their meals often in silence. They don't say anything. Why? Because to open your mouth and say something means that you might incur karma. They don't walk down the street looking to help old ladies across the street. Why? Because if you did that, you're incurring what? Karma. The more separated you are from everybody else, the better it is. And the more chance you'll achieve enlightenment. Karma is not the idea that we should do certain things so the universe will reward us. That's the Western concept, but that's not what the Buddhists believe. Or avoid certain things so that the universe will not punish us. That's kind of how we jokingly talk about karma, right? What goes around comes around. You're going to get it. But that's not how Buddhists think about karma. It's also not a force of justice seeking to right wrongs or give people what they deserve. We're talking about an impersonal consciousness here. The idea of moral justice, from one of their experts, arises out of the conception of a supreme being, a God who sits in judgment, who is a lawgiver and who decides what is right and wrong. There's a good quote to use with your Buddhist friends. He gets it, right? He's a Buddhist. He's one of their experts. He passed away a few years ago. He wrote a book called What the Buddha Taught. But he gets it exactly. That's exactly reality. The Buddhist doesn't accept reality. Instead, he believes in karma. But that's reality, right? From one of their own experts. That's the way things really are. There is right and wrong. There is a moral law. And it was given to us by a moral lawgiver we call God. So that's important. This threefold karma is based on the action energy, which is a cause and effect system based on our conduct, our speech, and our thoughts. We incur karma those ways. If you're looking to karma for moral justice and virtue, you will be disappointed. Even Buddhist experts like Rahula will tell you that you need a God for those things. That's a good point, isn't it, to engage Buddhists on? Are you looking for some kind of justice in this world? Are you looking for virtue in this world? Well, you won't find it in Buddhism. You need to go to God for those things. Ecclesiastes says this, the conclusion when all has been heard. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with Ecclesiastes, but Solomon basically was the wisest, wealthiest man who ever lived up until his point in time. I suppose Bill Gates is wealthier these days, but I mean back then, in ancient world, nobody had the wealth that Solomon had. Nobody had the power that Solomon had. Nobody had the possessions that Solomon had. People, kings and queens, came from all around the world just to meet him and see what he was doing. Solomon was an amazing man. And if you read the early chapters of Ecclesiastes, Solomon documents his journey through life. And he tells you what he tried to do. And he tells you he tried all sorts of things. He tried wealth. He went out there and amassed wealth. He set up businesses, and as they were in the ancient times, and he accumulated incredible wealth. He decided to make an empire and build, and he built great palaces and things like that. He decided to get into the whole Greenpeace thing and hug a tree, and he built parks everywhere, all these parks all over the place. He decided to love music. He tried music. Music's popular today, isn't it? People tune the world out through music. He decided to try that. He had all sorts of musical entertainment. He tried women. He thought sex was the answer. But no matter how many beautiful women he had, it was never enough. And he went through every aspect of life. And his conclusion was this. The conclusion when all has been heard, my conclusion, Solomon said, after living my life however I pleased, trying all that the world had to offer, fear God and keep his commands. This applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. And that's the message you need to bring to your Buddhist friends. Ultimately, karma is a lie. There is right and wrong. There is good and evil. There is morality. And the reason morality exists is because there is a moral lawgiver. And that moral lawgiver is God. And ultimately, everyone must stand before him. Do Buddhists believe in salvation? There is no salvation for the Buddhists. Only ethical living and meditative appeals to exalted beings. There's no certainty, just the hope of one day achieving enlightenment and ultimate nirvana. And you may never achieve it. You may go for the rest of eternity living one life after another, suffering time and time again, and never achieve this. It is a maybe. It is a possibility. It is not a certainty. Due to the incredible karmic debt accumulated through life. Can you imagine the debt that we incur going through life? The loose words we speak, the thoughts we think. Can you imagine that if our thoughts really did rack up karma? I mean, where would we be? All they really have to look forward to is an endless cycle of reincarnations and the brutal realization they will suffer through life again and again. Buddhism is a very contradictory belief system. If you believe the Theravada or the monastics, only they will achieve nirvana. If you believe the Mahayana path, this will open the door to the masses to achieve nirvana. They claim to have true teachings of Buddha and see the monks as narrow-minded. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Very narrow-minded group. Then there is the Vajrayana, which incorporates the Tantra, which refers to traditional mystical rituals and magical practices taken from Hindu groups in India. They seek enlightenment through active and moving rituals, repetitive incantations, sacred bodily movements, contemplation of religious icons and idols, that's where the idols come in Buddhism, and sexual rituals under the direction of their gurus. This is Buddhism. The Dalai Lama, as I told you earlier, belongs to this sect. Do Buddhists believe in heaven? The answer is no, they don't. They believe in a place called nirvana. The interesting thing about nirvana is it means to blow out. So they're like a candle. Your life, your soul, your consciousness, whatever you want to call it, is like a candle. And at the end it gets blown out or quenched. The final goal of Buddhism is nirvana, or having your soul literally blown out. When the quenching of all desire is complete and the person is transformed into another state. The interesting thing is, Buddha never explained what that state is. Why? Because Buddha never rose from the dead and never came back to tell anybody. He's still in the grave. In fact, his ashes are still around. They transport his ashes from place to place today. I believe the last place they were put on display was Paris. I'm not sure, you'd have to look it up online, but Mr. Google is your friend for that, I'm sure. But his ashes are literally carried around the world. But he does have a grave that can be visited, I believe. But ultimately, he never rose from the dead, and he never came back to tell anybody. what the real state is when you die. He simply refused to give his disciples an answer when they asked him about it. So the Buddhist idea of nirvana is that it's freedom from the cycle of karma and reincarnation, which is just suffering. Absorption or reunion with the world soul, or the oversoul, or however you want to call it, which involves the annihilation of your individuality, which simply means you will cease to exist. Since Buddhism ignores the divine entirely, and Buddha never gave them an answer, their teaching would seem to imply complete annihilation of the soul, not its absorption. So either way, whether they are absorbed into the whole and cease to be identified, or whether they are annihilated, either way, they cease to exist. What hope is there in that? None. None. If your individuality is lost entirely, or your soul is annihilated, you simply cease to exist, making Buddhism absolutely pointless. All you went through for nothing. Buddhism is a system of works by which the Buddhist hopes to save himself from an endless cycle of suffering, but instead blindly sends himself to the greatest suffering of all. Because the Bible says in Revelation 20, "Then I saw a great white throne, and him who sat upon it, from whose presence earth and heaven fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne, and books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged from the things which were written in the books according to their deeds. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead which were in them, and they were judged, every one of them, according to their deeds. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. The cycle will be finally broken. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire." This is the truth. This is reality. This is what a holy God says will happen. This is an accounting contained within the revelation of Jesus Christ at the end of our Bible, from one who has come back from the dead, and from one who knows the beginning from the end. And ultimately, that's the message we have to bring to our Buddhist friends, right? We need to help them to realize and understand that ultimately they will all give an account to a holy God. And if they don't get right with him now, it will be too late. Father, we just thank you for our time together. We thank you for this little insight into Buddhism. We pray for tomorrow, Lord, that it will go well, and that you bring many people here to worship you, and also, Lord, to attend the class so that they might learn how to better start up conversations in this environment. Lord, we're aware that Hong Kong is a very secular place, and even learning about Buddhism isn't going to necessarily swing the doors wide open. We need to be a little bit more clever than that in our conversations with people. But Lord, we know that still it dominates in the lives of many Chinese people and many other nations around the world. And Father, we pray that you would give us wisdom as we interact with people, that you would help us, Lord, to ask the right questions, to engage them on the right subjects. Lord, that we might truly have an impact as we look to share the gospel with as many people as we can. We know that truly it's a sad thing studying something like Buddhism, because in our faith, as we follow you, Lord, we have hope, we have assurance, we have certainty. We know where we're going, and we know what's going to happen. But for them, they don't experience any of that. There's no assurance, there's no certainty, there's no hope. Ultimately, it's all chance. And even that, we know is not real. And ultimately, they will all stand before you and give an account. So Lord, help us to be good witnesses. Help us to put you on display in our lives in the way that we live. And help us to be faithful in taking the opportunities that you bring us to talk with people and share with them the gospel. We commit the rest of this evening into your hands. We ask for a great time of fellowship together. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.